Today we're going to be talking about the transition out of slavery um, in West Africa. And in the first part, I'm going to actually talk a little bit about the context, and then before I actually talk about Al-Haji Muhammad Ali Sa'id, who was also known as Sergeant Nicolas Sa'id. With the abolition of the slave trade by the British and the campaign to end the transatlantic slave trade, uh, there was a major adjustment in West Africa, because what had been a major export, that is slaves, was no longer possible, especially after the 1830s and 1840s. And the shift that occurred as a result was the development of other exports, which were referred to at the time as legitimate trade objects, and because by then slaves were no longer considered to be legal as an export and therefore were deemed illegitimate. So the concept of legitimate trade came into play as a corollary to the idea of the abolition of the slave trade. Now, in reality, of course, legality depends upon the country, and since in many parts of Africa the slave trade was still legal, from their perspective, the slave trade was just as legitimate as the trade in slaves, as the trade in any other commodity was the same thing. So there was an ideological and political struggle that took place, particularly in West Africa, because the initial British campaign to abolish the slave trade only applied to the territory north of the equator until 1830, when it was then extended south of the equator, and then subsequently all the way around to East Africa as well. So the shift to legitimate trade resulted in the promotion of the production of other commodities. The two most important were peanuts in the Senegal River Basin and Gambia region. Peanuts were wanted in Europe because of their oil, more than the fact that they were peanuts. It was wanted much more because of the vegetable oil that was contained in the nuts. And it was used for a variety of purposes, but most important in the making of soap, as was indeed the other major commodity that replaced slaves as the export, which was palm oil. Palm oil too was wanted because of its oil, and it came from the palm trees along in the forest regions of particularly Nigeria and Ghana and Sierra Leone, those areas of West Africa. And the palm oil is a particularly good oil for actually lubricating machinery. And before the development of petroleum as a better oil to lubricate machinery and to use as a fuel, palm oil had that impact. And so as with the increasing industrialization in Britain in particular, but also elsewhere, there was a need for an oil that could serve as a lubricant. And also palm oil was also used as the basis of making soap. And indeed the use of palm oil for soap is reflected in the name palm oil, palm olive, one of the companies that makes soap. So palm olive is a derivative name from palm oil. So those two commodities, but others too, gum arabic, which is a sticky substance that's taken off of a bush in the southern Sahara, was used because it was an important ingredient in dyeing. There were also tropical woods, such as mahogany, were also cut and then exported to Europe. So there was a number of commodities, including the tusks of elephants, until all of the elephants virtually in West Africa were decimated and they no longer existed. And thereafter, ivory became a major export from East Africa for quite some time thereafter, with the same decimating impact on elephant herds, because there was no attempt to protect elephants so that they could reproduce, and in effect they were eventually annihilated almost everywhere until the few surviving ones were protected in the late 20th century. And of course now it's illegal to even trade in ivory, but no, that was not so in the 19th century. And every piano used ivory. There were lots of different types of table ornaments, from salt shakers to all kinds of ornamental things that people put on their bookshelves that were made out of ivory. So that shift to the production of those commodities from the export of people may sound as if it was a dramatic shift in the economies and societies of Africa. And to a great extent it was. For one thing, palm oil tended to be produced or could be produced in small quantities, while to buy and sell an individual required a certain amount of capital, a certain amount of money, unless you actually were selling people that you kidnapped yourself, or you were war prisoners that were then deported to the Americas. But the production of palm oil and peanuts could be done on any size of agricultural holdings, although in fact in many places they were produced on what amounted to as plantations. And as a result, actually the incidence of slavery in West Africa itself increased during the 19th century, because slaves were used to a great extent in the production of peanuts and in the production of palm oil, and indeed in production of many other commodities too that were not exported. And in this case, it meant that the local people in the local states of West Africa, whether it was Ashanti or the Yoruba states that survived the collapse of Oyo, or in the Igbo area of the Bight of Biafra, there were more and more slaves than ever before for the production of these commodities that were considered legitimate trade, although in fact they involve the use of slave labor. So one of the major themes of the 19th century is to understand the shift that took place and the changes that resulted from the shift from exporting people as slaves to exporting so-called legitimate goods that were very often, in fact, produced by slaves, or because both peanuts and palm oil had to be carried to the coast, it also meant that the people that actually transported these goods to the coast were often slaves carrying them on their heads, because especially in the Niger Delta and in the Yoruba area, there was no livestock to do that, and at the time there were no canals and there were no railroads, so that it had to be all transported by humans, and those humans often were slaves. So that we have in effect a contradiction. On the one hand, Britain is abolishing and eventually does succeed in abolishing the slave trade from West Africa. On the other hand, the development of the other commodities that became the exports instead were produced by slaves. Now, the interior of West Africa was quite different because of the jihad movement. And as we've indicated, the jihad movement, to some extent, happened in response to the transatlantic slave trade by Muslim states that did not want to be involved in that trade. So in a sense, that shift from the export of slaves to the export of other commodities already had begun in the interior, in areas that were controlled by Muslims, especially in the areas that resulted in the creation of the jihad states. Well, as I've also indicated, the jihad states themselves ended up with substantial enslaved populations that were involved in agricultural production and in production of textiles and so on, and salt and other minerals. And so that there too, the incidence of slavery increased dramatically in the 19th century, so that one of the developments of Africa during the period that's usually referred as the transition out of slavery and as an export to legitimate goods was in fact an increase of slavery within Africa itself. And this pattern would last until the end of the 19th century and the conquest of most of Africa by European countries. By the end of the 19th century, European countries were actually justifying their imperialist military conquest on the basis that they were trying to end slavery within Africa, which of course is quite ironic since the whole process had begun with the slave trade itself, the process of the spread of slavery and the process of the integration of African economies into a world system. So I want to talk more specifically about one case, the case of Muhammad Ali Sa'id, as an example of what was happening at the same time that there was this shift on the coast. In the interior, there was no such shift. There was an increase in enslavement, as I've indicated, and Muhammad Ali Sa'id was a victim of that increased enslavement in the interior. He's a particularly interesting individual, and so his story is most unusual. Here is a photograph of him. This was taken in 1863. He's wearing a uniform of the Union Army in the American Civil War, because what we're going to find happens is this guy, whose original name was Muhammad Ali Sa'id, came from the interior of West Africa, was enslaved in the jihad, and rather than being taken across the Atlantic, he was taken across the Sahara. So he went an entirely different route. I'm going to explain how he somehow crossed the Sahara Desert as a slave and ultimately ended up in North America and enlisting in the Union Army to fight in the Civil War to abolish slavery in the United States. So he is, in a particular and interesting way, is involved in that transition from slavery to freedom, carrying his own particular odyssey, following his odyssey from West Africa, in the interior of West Africa, and ending up in the United States. And indeed, he was very briefly also in Canada, as you will see. So Nicolas Sa'id, who was born Muhammad Ali Sa'id, was a Muslim. He came from the state of Borno, and he was enslaved at a time that Borno and the Sokoto Caliphate were at war with each other, and he was a product of that war. He came from Borno. These are two slides that show the ruler of Borno at the time. His name was Muhammad al-Kanemi. He's pictured there on the left, and he's in what looks like a cage, but is in fact a royal enclosure on the right with people before him. This is a photo from the early a drawing from the early 1820s. Al-Kanemi was the Borno ruler who successfully organized resistance to the Sokoto Caliphate, although raiding and fighting between the two states continued for some time, and as a result of that, Muhammad Ali Sa'id was enslaved. And now who was Muhammad Ali Sa'id? He was actually the son of the highest ranking general in the Borno army, and hence was the son of the general that reported to this ruler, Al-Kanemi. And his father's name, Muhammad Ali Sa'id's father's name was Barka Ghana. Barka Ghana himself was a slave. He was a royal slave. And he was, as I said, the highest ranking general in the Borno army, and therefore the right-hand man of Al-Kanemi, the ruler. And he then subsequently was a governor of one of the most important provinces of the Borno state. He had an extended family. He had several wives, and the son of one of his wives, his mother was from Mandara, which is one of the provinces of Borno on the southern shores of Lake Chad. And Barka Ghana was a governor of a neighboring province there too, and it was in this context that our Muhammad Ali Sa'id was raised. In fact, he spent a lot of the time in the palace. And by the time he was born, Al-Kanemi's son was now in power by the name of Umar, and he became the second ruler of the reform government of Borno. And so Muhammad Ali, even though he was technically a slave, because his father was technically a slave, he was brought up in the palace, and he was extremely well educated. And he was treated like any other member of the aristocracy because of his father's status, first as a general and then as a governor that was involved in the politics of the state. So that it's important to understand that at the time of his enslavement, Muhammad Ali was still nonetheless technically a slave. The reason for that, to understand that, is because of a very important distinction between slavery in Islamic society and slavery in the Americas. And that is that slavery in Islamic society, a person's status followed the status of his father. And since his father was technically a slave, even though he was very wealthy and very powerful, that meant his children were also technically slaves. And we'll understand why what that significance is in a minute. So that Al-Kanemi's son, Sheikh Umar ibn Muhammad al-Kanemi, was the ruler of Borno from 1837 to 1853. And this was the period when Muhammad Ali was born, and this was the period in which Muhammad Ali actually became a slave. This is two pictures of the capital of Borno at the time. The building on the right is referred to as the Dendal. It's in the capital of Kukawa. That Al-Kanemi established this new city of Kukawa because the old capital of Borno was destroyed in the jihad. It was a dual city with a palace, and it's a very extensive palace, really being on one side of town, and the rest of the city in the commercial ward on the other side of the town. And then the area in between was a parade ground, was an open space. It was a place where marketing was done, livestock was sold. and that's with the palace, as you can see there in the background. Um, his mother actually came, although she lived in Mandara, actually had come from further south, from an area that was controlled by Borno, an area that was referred to by the people who live there, who are Margi. The Margi people were not Muslims, unlike Borno, which was a Muslim state. And so you see a picture here of a beer market on the right, and you see a village above. And about half of the Margi country had been subdued and paid tribute. The other half was an area which was raided for slaves by Borno, so it was very much a frontier region. And this is where Muhammad Ali's mother came from, before she married his father. One curious, interesting detail that relates to the period, as we're going to see, and the reading assignment for this week is first a summary of Muhammad Ali Sa'id's life that I've written, that identifies what he did and where he went, which this PowerPoint is going to show you excerpts of. And in his autobiography, Sa'id makes an unbelievable identification. He says that in 1851 he actually saw and met a European, and there were no Europeans except for this man that were in Borno at the time. And that man was an extremely important individual by the name of Heinrich Barth, pictured here, who had crossed the Sahara in 1849 and stayed south of the Sahara until 1855, and traveling from Borno to the Sokoto Caliphate to Timbuktu and back to the Sokoto Caliphate and then back to Borno for a second visit before returning across the Sahara. He was German, but he was actually an official of the British government. And he went, and this was a diplomatic mission that he was on to establish, to consolidate relations between the Sokoto Caliphate and Borno and Britain. He's also very important because he wrote a 5-volume account of his journals. He wrote a 3-volume collection of vocabularies of some 11 different languages. He himself was fluent in Arabic and Hausa, besides German, of course, and besides English, of course, and also Latin and Greek and half a dozen other languages. He was a truly astonishing individual. He had a PhD in archaeology. He had been an archaeologist in North Africa and Tunisia and in Libya, and had been involved in the exploration of Roman ruins in North Africa. That's where he learned his Arabic. He was really a scholar in the modern sense of the term scholar. The PhD, the multiple languages, his scientific approach to recording what he saw and who he talked with, so that besides his diplomatic functions, he actually collected numerous documents, Arabic documents about the region. He met, of course, all the rulers because he was so important. And so it's really astonishing that our man, Muhammad Ali Sa'id, actually met him in Borno. And later, as it turns out, he would meet him again by coincidence in London in 1859. And in his autobiography, he mentions Heinrich Barth and mentions that he recognized him when he saw him in London, and they talked and so on. The strange thing is that he wrote all this down in his autobiography, and nobody who ever read his autobiography would have known who Heinrich Barth was at that time. It just wasn't possible. So it's a nice little detail from his autobiography that sort of attests to his authenticity, Muhammad Ali's authenticity as an observer himself and as a traveler. Uh, Muhammad Ali was kidnapped uh, by Tuareg nomads who captured him and a bunch of his fellow friends when the boys, because they were in their late teens, all went on a hunting expedition into the wilds of the territory near Lake Chad. And as Ali Sa'id writes in his in his autobiography, he actually had violated his mother's instructions because she had told him definitely not to go hunting. And of course, like some teenagers, sometimes disregarded his mother advice and, in fact, orders, and with his buddies went into the wilds, and all of them were kidnapped, and all of them were taken as slaves to North Africa as a result. They first traveled west into the Sokoto Caliphate because the Tuareg were allied with the Sokoto Caliphate, and they went to the city of Katsina, which is pictured here, one of the gates into the city, and then the minaret, the Goberal minaret of the mosque, which dates back to the 15th century, still there in Katsina today. And indeed, just to foreshadow my own movements, in a few weeks I'm going to be going to Katsina to a conference. And I will be going to the Goberal minaret, and I will be going through this gate into Katsina because I have some research that I want to do there, part of which relates to Muhammad Ali Sa'id. They were taken by camel caravan, all of that included quite a few slaves. They went past these very important salt works in the middle of the Sahara at a place called Bilma, which had been, it wasn't at this point, but it had been part of the Borno state, so it was something that Muhammad Ali actually knew quite a bit about. The salt was, as you can see on the right, processed and taken south of the Sahara and sold because there was very little salt available south of the Sahara, and hence it was quite a valuable commodity. He was taken across the Sahara to the north to an oasis, Merzurk, which is today in in extreme western Libya, very close to the border with Tripoli. And here are pictures of what Merzurk looked like at the time, and these are modern pictures, but these fortifications were as would have been the same at the time that Muhammad Ali was there. In Merzurk, he was purchased by an officer who was stationed there. Merzurk was part of the Ottoman Empire at this time, and this was an outpost of the Ottoman Empire into the Sahara Desert. The Ottoman Empire had very close relationships with Borno. He was purchased by an officer, Turkish officer, who's actually wasn't Turkish at all. His ethnically Turkish. He actually came from Albania. And he was taken from there to Tripoli. This is the Turkish clock tower that's at the entrance to the market in Tripoli. He was actually there, came into the possession of the uncle of the officer from Merzurk, and that uncle, Albanian, uh, and partly, I think, also partly Arab because I think he was married to a woman who was Arab. Uh, so, and he was a wealthy merchant who dealt in tobacco in the market. And at this time, all of his Muhammad Ali's companions were ransomed and went home to Borno. The only one that was not ransomed, perhaps because he was technically a slave by birth, was Muhammad Ali himself. He remained in the possession of the Turkish merchant, and the Turkish merchant really launched him on an unbelievable odyssey that would take him to Mecca, that would take him to Turkey. He would end up in Russia. He would travel all over Western Europe. He would travel to the Caribbean. He would travel to North America. He would travel to Canada before he would eventually enlist in the Union Army and fight in the American Civil War. Here's an inside picture of the Tripoli market, very much as it would have looked like in the 19th century, although this is a relatively contemporary photograph, but you can see it's a covered market because of the heat. And as I said, his master actually sold tobacco. Uh, so, but he was taken, he went on with his master. His master had been on pilgrimage to Mecca before, but he went on pilgrimage again, and he took his young slave with him. They went to Cairo and actually stayed in Bulaq, which is a suburb or a part of Cairo that's right on the Nile River, and you see pictures of the Nile River and what the region looked like at the time, and indeed to some extent what it looks like today. After going to Mecca, and indeed on to Yemen, and then returning to Mecca, and then returning to Cairo, and then returning to Tripoli. When they arrived back in Tripoli, they discovered, his master discovered there had been a terrible fire in the market, and it destroyed his shop and destroyed most of his wealth that was contained in the tobacco shop and the adjacent warehouse. And in effect, the merchant lost all of his wealth. And at that point, he had no choice but to sell his young slave, who was worth a lot of money. The reason he was worth a lot of money is because he was Muhammad Ali had been well educated, and he very clearly was a very intelligent young man, which the rest of his odyssey will demonstrate again and again. And you will also see it because you're reading and you have access, besides my article which discusses his life and career, you have access to his autobiography that he wrote himself. He wrote it in English. He published that autobiography in Memphis, Tennessee in 1873. And he published that autobiography in English. And at the time, English was the 11th language that he had become fluent in. And when you read the autobiography, you will see how unbelievably fluent this man was. This was not an edited manuscript or something like Muhammad Gardo Bakwakwa's one. This is something where this is extremely well written. So when he was sold, he was taken to actually he was taken to a place called Izna, or Smyrna. At the time it was called Smyrna, as today called Izna, on the southern shore of Turkey on the Mediterranean. And he subsequently then became a slave to Mustafa Rashid Pasha, who was a very, very high government official in the Turkish government. This man was a chief architect of what are known as the Tanzimat reforms. They were the reforms introduced in the Turkish Empire in 1839, trying to reform the government and its administration in the face of the increasing dangers and threat from Europe in terms of the Ottoman Empire was losing ground in terms of its supremacy in the Mediterranean, and was being undermined by the vast changes that were taking place in Western Europe. And so there was an attempt within the Ottoman Empire to reform government, to make it more modern. And this was the man he was in possession of. He was then subsequently given as a gift, virtually, and by this time, even though he was still a slave, to another member of the Turkish elite, Mahmud Fuad Pasha, who was a member of and chairman of the Reform Council, and he was also foreign minister of the Ottoman state for several years at the end of the 1850s. And as a slave, Muhammad Ali Sa'id's job at the time was actually the job of cleaning water pipes, and he was so he kept all of the water pipes in which the elite, these elite members used to smoke tobacco, and that was his sole job. But so he was around the elite all the time. He was considered a very bright young man, and obviously good with language. His Turkish was impeccable. His Arabic was impeccable. He also spoke, of course, several languages that he had learned as a child south of the Sahara. And in the course of that, he came to the attention of this man, who was the Russian ambassador to Turkey. And as the Russian ambassador, he was in deep negotiations with the Turkish government, because these were the years that would lead up to and indeed culminate in the Crimean War, which was a war that pitted Russia against the Ottoman Empire, with Britain coming into the war on the side of the Ottoman Empire, and ultimately the defeat of Russia in Crimea. But more important than that was a further weakening of the Ottoman Empire in lieu of European military strength. But nonetheless, at the point in which Muhammad Ali comes into the possession of this man, he's no longer a slave. He's no longer a slave for several reasons. First of all, it was illegal in the Ottoman Empire to sell a slave to a non-Muslim, and that was just not acceptable. So therefore he had to have been given to him virtually as a gift, and then he became the personal valet of in the course of which he therefore ended up going to St. Petersburg, indeed on to Moscow. But before he went, he was taken to Odessa, which is on the Crimea. This is before the war actually broke out. And although there was some possibility that Muhammad Ali's account of Odessa is secondhand and he didn't really go there, nonetheless he claims he did, and he claims that's where he learned Russian, was in Odessa. And this is a picture of what Odessa looked like, a beautiful city on the northern shore of the Black Sea. But he ended up in St. Petersburg. He actually lived on this street, Nevsky Prospect. This is sort of what it looked like at the time. He lived obviously in a very wealthy household. But his master, the Russian diplomat to the Ottoman Empire, then subsequently, once he returned to Russia, became commander-in-chief of the Russian forces in the Crimea. And then he went off to the Crimea on the shores of the Black Sea to lead the Russian troops in the battles there. and as a result, um, our man didn't go with him, but was transferred as a valet to another member of the aristocracy pictured here, uh, Trubetskoy, and whom he then worked with for a number of years. In fact, Trubetskoy took him to Latvia, and in Riga, the capital of Latvia, uh, uh, Sa'id converted, or was forced to convert, to a Russian Orthodoxy, which is where he from there on was known as Nicolas Sa'id rather than Muhammad Ali Sa'id. And he traveled all over Russia, and as well as Latvia, uh, and as a valet, uh, no longer a slave, now simply an employed servant, living in very close proximity to his employer, and uh, wearing what were considered at the time to be Turkish clothing, so that he looked quite exotic and uh, quite strange, as a matter of fact, in terms of European dress. But he was taken from there all across Western Europe. You can read about it the extent that you want in his long autobiography that he wrote and published in the United States. But it's possible to actually find pictures of some of the hotels that he stayed in. This one is the Victoria Hotel in Baden-Baden in Germany, as it looked in 1880, but it would have looked exactly the same when he was there in the middle of the 1850s. Um, he he visited Italy during the summer several times, and because he was always with, as a valet, was with an extremely important Russian diplomat and government official. He met so many important people, it's amazing. And here's a picture of one of them, is the Cardinal Antonelli, who he met several times. And Cardinal Antonelli would go on to become the Pope. He describes a prison near Rome. All this, his description appears to have been taken out of another book. It's not really clear whether or not he ever actually went there, although he claimed he did. He stayed at the Hotel Mirabeau in Paris, very near now where the Eiffel Tower is located. This is a picture of what the Hotel Mirabeau looked like on the Rue de Pas in Paris. The building itself is still there, although it's no longer a hotel. Um, from Paris and the many other places that he went to in Western Europe, he went to the opera, he went to theater, he learned language after language after language. He recounts the books that he read. He obviously had a lot of spare time. Being a valet of somebody important didn't mean that you were working all the time at all, and hence he lived a quite luxurious life. Uh, he This is his first visit to London. He stayed in Hanover Square, where you can go and you can see today. It looks very much like this today too, with beautiful old buildings around it. He's in the lower left-hand picture. He stayed down that street just off of Hanover Square. Um, when he was in London in about 1859, I guess it was, he decided, he told his employer, the Russian prince, that he no longer wanted to be a valet and that he wanted to go home and visit his mother. And he made plans to do so by moving out of Hanover Square and moving into a place which is called the Stranger's Home in Limehouse on the West India Docks, which is where transients and others who could afford it stayed while they were in transit. And this is a picture of where he stayed. And when he was about ready to go to back to Europe and then back to the Ottoman Empire, and so he could cross the Sahara again, um, he was approached by another wealthy individual, a Dutchman, um, who had just married a wealthy English woman, and he was offered a very good employment to be the valet to the couple. And instead of going back home, he went with them on their honeymoon when they crossed the Atlantic and went to the Caribbean, stopping first in Portland, Maine, and then in New York City, and then on a cruise to Suriname, which was still then a Dutch colony, and which was where the Dutchmen had a plantation. So he went on that trip through the Caribbean, came back to the United States. This one seems to be out of order. This is the Paddington Hotel in London, which is where he stayed also when he was in London. Um, when he when he came back to the United States, his employer and wife traveled to upstate New York, and they went to Niagara Falls, and they went on through Toronto to Ottawa, and they stayed in. I've got some slides out of order here, for which I apologize. When this goes online, they'll be in order. This is showing Union Square in New York City, which is where he did go through. He passed it, went to. He was in he was in New York City before he went to the Caribbean. He left from New York City. We have records of what ship he was on and so on. But this is shown, in the previous slide was the Reverend Cheevers, who was the minister at this church. This is on Union Square. That church on Union Square is right there today. And the only thing different from that is you're going to see a lot of cars and the subway stop rather than the horses and the buggies. And he and his Dutch employer and wife went to church here to hear the Reverend Cheevers give an abolitionist speech, and they were the subject of extreme controversy because they broke the rules of the church, and Muhammad Ali, or Nicolas Sa'id, sat in the pew immediately behind his employer and wife, while in fact the church had a separate section which was for black people. And since he was a black person, he's supposed to sit up there, and the sermon was stopped and they had to leave the church, even though they were an abolitionist. It shows the racism that existed at the same time, and became a subject of controversy in the local newspapers about how they were treated. It's interesting that in his autobiography he does not mention this incident at all, although we're possible to find out about it through the newspapers. This is the passenger list that shows that he actually was on the ship that went with his Dutch employer to the Caribbean. So anyway, back to Niagara Falls and Toronto, and where else he went beyond that. He went to Ottawa with his master, and they stayed in the British Hotel in Aylmer, Quebec, which is actually just across the river from Ottawa, now part of the city of Hull. And they stayed in this building, the British Hotel, which is still there. Stands. This is a modern picture of that hotel. And it was here in the British Hotel in Aylmer, Quebec, that Sa'id's life changed dramatically. And the reason it changed dramatically is because his Dutch employer and wife, for some reason that we don't really entirely understand, but we think that the main reason is that they ran out of money. And poor Nicholas was left in the hotel while first his employer went to Montreal and then sent for his wife to come to Montreal with him. And from there, we've actually been able to follow them in great detail. They went to Vermont. He subsequently became a lawyer. They subsequently divorced, and his ex-wife moved to Quebec City. while the Dutchman himself, now a lawyer, ended up traveling all over the United States, going to Minneapolis, going to Kansas, and ending up in California. But what they did with Nicholas is they left him in Ottawa with all the baggage and with the huge hotel bill. And after a couple of months waiting for his employer and wife to return, they didn't return, and so eventually the hotel kicked Nicholas out into the street and confiscated all the luggage. Needless to say, that put Nicholas in quite a difficult position because he didn't know anybody, and there he was in Ottawa, essentially, without employment. So he made his way to Ogdensburg on the St. Lawrence River and worked on boats until he got to Detroit. Uh, and when he got to Detroit, of all things, the most unbelievable coincidence, he met a man, Reverend George Duffield, who was the president, was the preacher at the Protestant church, which later changed its name to a Presbyterian church in Detroit. And he had unbelievably had met this man, Reverend George Duffield, before on the Aegean Sea, when he had traveled from the Ottoman Empire, from Istanbul up the Aegean Sea, and then gone by train and then by coach on his way to St. Petersburg. And for some reason, this guy George Duffield was on that same boat, and as a result, when Nicolas Sa'id reached Detroit, George Duffield helped him get a job. He ended up actually being a tutor and teaching French, of all things, in a black school in Detroit in 1861, 1862. And then it was in 1863 that he took another train and joined the 55th Massachusetts all-black regiment in the Union Army. In short, he signed up to fight for the liberty of blacks in the United States, even though he had never been a slave in the United States and had not crossed the Atlantic as a slave. And this slide shows the 55th Massachusetts as it's marching into Charleston, occupied Charleston at the end of the Civil War, and Nicolas Sa'id remained in Charleston after the Civil War and became part of one of the officials, another very bad slide, but nonetheless showing the 55th Massachusetts Regiment, this all-black regiment. And Nicolas Sa'id then became a member of the Freedmen's Bureau. He became an assistant commissioner, registering voters, that is blacks, former slaves, registering voters in the District of Berkeley, which was just outside of Charleston. And this shows, in the next couple of slides, it shows several of the leaders of the black community after the Civil War in Charleston and in South Carolina. Here, Benjamin Franklin Randolph, who was one of the most important of the leaders, elected to the state senate of South Carolina and was running for senator of South Carolina for Washington, and virtually certainly would have been elected, except that in 1868 he was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan, as was this man, Jonathan Jasper Wright, who was subsequently also murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. Was another individual that Nicolas Sa'id in his autobiography specifically mentions as somebody who was important and he knew and thought a lot of. It's very clear that the Ku Klux Klan at the time singled out the most prominent of the blacks in the black community, the leaders, the intellectuals, and these are the people they deliberately murdered. What Nicolas Sa'id did from then on was he taught school. He taught school, he founded schools, he went on public lectures all through South Carolina, Georgia, and then Alabama. He was an amazing, as he writes in his autobiography, which you can look at and see, he was very, very politically conscious, ideologically unbelievably developed. He consciously remained in the United States, in the South, because he really thought it was important to educate black people because of the legacy of slavery, and he did everything he could. And despite the fact that Ku Klux Klan was killing people left, right, and center. Here shows Bladden Springs in Alabama, near where he lived. He married in Alabama, and we don't know at this point what happened to his wife or whether he ever had any children. And we do know that he had a bank account in Tallahassee, Florida. We have records of it here. And we do know that his reputation, at least within the black community, was well known by then, because there's a note on this, on the bank records when he opened his account that said, "This is the wonderful Nicolas Sa'id indeed." He was a teacher at this point. He tried to do his best in Alabama. He approached and wrote a lot of letters to this man, Colonel William Oates, who had been an officer in the Confederate Army and who would later be governor of Alabama, who was an unbelievable racist, but nonetheless, Sa'id tried his best to bridge the gap, to find a patron in the white community that would help protect him. As far as we can tell, it didn't work, and subsequently he moved to Brownsville, Tennessee, where we initially thought he died, but in fact we now know he did not die there in 1882, but lived at least as late as 1897 and maybe later. We know far less about his last years of his life, but we do know that he continued, but he definitely moved out of the South because of the dangers of living there. And for the final part of this lecture, it's the important thing to recognize about Brownsville is that Tina Turner comes from just outside of Brownsville, and hence one could say that indeed it's almost certain that her grandparents went to a school where Nicolas Sa'id was the teacher, and this is where Tina Turner is from. And so the theme song of this lecture is best represented by Tina Turner herself, which I am now closing with. We don't need another hero. We got one. No one knows about this man. President Trump should know about this man.